Hi, and welcome to the Vue CLI for people scared of the Vue CLI, which, spoiler, was me, at least when I began. So real quick about myself, my name is Raymond Camden. I am a developer evangelist for Here Technologies. We do a lot of mapping and navigation type stuff, both for mobile SDKs and the web. And if you have any questions about that, you can definitely hit me up. I blog at Raymond Camden, and I have a contact form there. And I tweet at Raymond Camden, and my DMs are open. And I love to get questions. So if you have any questions about Vue and what I'm talking about today, or navigation and what I do in my 9-to-5 job, definitely reach out. I would also be happy to tell you about how fun it is to play Just Dance and what great exercise and fun it is. So just a little bit more about myself. I have been a web developer for a very long time. I think around 94, 95, 96 or so. So quite a bit, quite a lot of experience. And I'm very, very confident in saying that I am almost a good web developer. I feel like I'm almost competent. As a great example, like a concrete example of that, I'm definitely at the level where I know a lot of the JavaScript methods and APIs, etc. And when working with arrays, I have almost memorized which ones mutate the original array and which one returns new ones. I tend to keep a tab open to MDN so I can check those docs. And speaking of, I'm really, really proud of this. A few weeks ago, I wrote a reduce function, and I got it almost working without needing to check the docs. But, I got most of the way there. I kind of knew what I was doing. It almost worked, and I just had to do a little bit, better research to actually finish it. But yeah, that is kind of like where I am as a developer. I am a very slow learner. I will not deny that at all. But, luckily we have some really good resources out there to make it a little bit easier for us. I'm also a Vue.js developer. I started working with Vue back in August of 2017, so a little bit over 3 years ago. I can distinctly remember before that time, going to web-based conferences and seeing Vue.js and there not being too many people there. It was sometimes put in the back corner of the conference. Wasn't terribly popular. Certainly that's not the case now. It's definitely gotten very, very popular. But like for me, what happened is that, I finally saw the conference talk that clicked with me, that made the light bulb go off, and I started to play with it. So I did a blog post where I talked about what I thought about it and, how I built a sample application with it. And, things kind of snowballed from there. So in the last couple of years, I've written over 100 blog posts on it. I've written for other publications. I've talked about Vue.js a lot. I still think I'm very much a beginner. But when I look at Vue.js compared to some of the other frameworks that I've worked with, what is it about Vue that got me so excited about it and so passionate about, learning it? And I think that the reason is that it was very easy to play with Vue.js. All right. So, I had come into Vue with some experience with Angular, and I liked Angular. It felt like a good framework. It felt like I could build big things with it, but I would never casually use Angular. The example I like to give is that my wife and I, we have a bunch of kids between us. We have 8 kids. And when you have that many kids, you don't casually do anything at all. Anything that you do as a family requires massive planning to ensure that, everyone gets to where they need to go. If you look at the documentation for Vue, they talk about how it was meant to be used easily. It was meant to be used incrementally adoptable, in this progressive enhancement, type thing. And that really, really worked well for me because for years now, as I learn and work with JavaScript and listen to people much smarter than myself talk about JavaScript, it feels like a lot of web development is focused on building apps. So I have an entire application that's built with JavaScript, and it's like a Gmail clone, or it's a admin interface, and it feels like people very rarely talk about this basic example of progressive enhancement. For example, I just want to drop in a script tag. Vue let me do that. I could drop a script tag in, and then I could just write some logic. I could just add a little bit of interactivity to a web page. And again, this is one of the soapboxes that I get on. I apologize in advance, but I know there's still a lot of people doing that. They're adding a little bit of interactivity to an existing web page to make it better for their users. And I feel like people rarely talk about that. Another big thing is that I could use a tool like CodePen. So I used CodePen a lot to just say, oh, hey, this is a weird new thing in Vue, or new to me. Let me do a quick CodePen and actually see it running. And the fact that there was no build process for any of that was really compelling. And there's nothing at all wrong with a build process. But as soon as I know that I have to do a couple different things to test something, as soon as I know that there's a process involved, I get a little bit like, okay, do I really want to do this? Is it worth my time? And I have always felt with Vue, because it did not require that build process, I was much more inclined to play and experiment and do things. And that's not to say that you can't do that with React and Angular as well. But Vue felt like it was tailored to people like myself. And for me, it really became like a better jQuery. And I'm putting for me in parentheses because it's it's kind of a big thing nowadays to attack jQuery or to say you don't need jQuery. And I absolutely don't need jQuery anymore, but I know a lot of people still do. And jQuery is still an incredibly powerful, useful tool for a lot of people. For me, what I found is that I was either doing jQuery or Angular. So I was doing a little bit of progressive enhancement, or I was using Angular to build an application. And Vue replaced jQuery for me, and sometimes even replaced cases where I would use Angular for smaller things. But essentially, it became my new jQuery, and I ended up using it everywhere. And I'm actually finding myself forcing myself not to always use Vue, especially when vanilla JavaScript would be good enough. So I assume, like a lot of people, how I build things and the way I build things is evolving and will continue to evolve. So I love that Vue supported me on that type of development. But as we know, Vue absolutely is definitely capable of building applications. And typically we call these single page applications, or SPA for short. Vue definitely fits the bill. So the first question that you may ask yourself is like, when do you know in terms of like, okay, I'm building something and it's just going to be progressive enhancement, or it's actually going to be, a real application. So how do you know when to do that? Now, luckily, it's extremely easy to know when to do that. And I'm going to give you crystal clear rules that you could apply to every single project out there that will definitely tell you when you could do one versus the other. Yeah, unfortunately, it's never going to be that kind of cut and dry. But for me, kind of like my litmus test in terms of, when I need to build a real application, and I shouldn't say real application because progressive enhancement is real development as well. But, when do I need to build an application versus just doing progressive enhancement on a page? Certainly, if I'm going to be doing multiple screens, so I have a login form and then I have multiple editing forms, or I have a login form and something else. As soon as I can see multiple views in my brain, then I start thinking about, I'm probably going to be building an application. Certainly, if the file size gets to a point where you're seeing, over 1,000 lines of code, then you may have kind of crossed the line between, what is is appropriate for a simple progressive enhancement. Definitely, when you start working with multiple people, and some of the aspects of working with Vue applications really work great with multiple people involved versus having one HTML file and one JavaScript file. And kind of lastly, projects I think tend to grow, not shrink. So it may start off with you thinking that, hey, this could be simple progressive enhancement. And then the client says, hey, we also need this, and we also need that, and we also need this, as well. So things tend to, I think, go in that direction versus getting simpler. So, hey, this is great. This is where that CLI can come in and really help you. So, some basics about the CLI to keep in mind. It is installed via NPM. You do not need to know what NPM is. There are people out there who don't know what that is. I wish more of us who do know what that is. We're going to keep that in mind. NPM can be a bit scary for people who have never worked with it. Its main application, or at least its main use for me, is scaffolding new applications. So by that, I mean laying out the groundwork for you to start building on top of it. It also provides a nice and easy way to quickly add new features. There's also kind of a cool visual UI, something that I don't use very often, but I'm going to show you an example of it, and it may work very well for you. And kind of lastly, it has a little prototyping feature as well. Again, not something that I use terribly often, but you may find it really helpful. So, what the heck is NPM? NPM stands for Node Package Manager. It is a very versatile way to install things. And at a high level, basically, if I'm building something and I need to depend on something else, let's say I need to depend on a library called A, one called B, and one called C. Via NPM and the way it works with things, I could say my application needs A, B, and C. And when you install it, NPM will take care of grabbing A, B, and C. Now, if A needs X, Y, and Z, NPM will take care of getting that. If X, Y, and Z need zeta, beta, gamma, whatever, basically it will follow all of that path down for me and get every single dependency out there. That's why you see a lot of people use NPM. It's primarily meant for Node.js development. But you do not need to know anything at all about Node. You don't need to care about Node. As a web developer, I really like knowing about Node.js and using Node.js, but keep in mind that you do not need to know it. And I'll say this right now. One of the things that I'm going to say probably a couple times in this presentation is that you don't need to care about so-and-so. When I say that, I absolutely don't mean that you can ignore it forever or that you shouldn't learn it. But what I tend to find is that if I'm learning a topic and it all of a sudden drops 20 things on my lap, I try my best to figure out, okay, what do I need to know right now? What do I need to know to get started and experiment and play? And then I kind of gradually bring those things in. So you will absolutely hear me say a couple times today, don't worry about that, worry about it later. Again, that's not meant to say that you should ignore it per se, but that it may be something that you could wait till tomorrow as you learn and play. So you will want to install Node. That is the easiest way to get NPM. Luckily, that is pretty much boilerplate. You go to nodejs.org, it even sniffs your operating system and tells you what to download. You can get either LTS or current, just grab the first link that you see. Yes, there is a difference. No, you don't have to worry about it for right now. I will say I'm on a Windows machine. I am using Windows Subsystem for Linux, so my install was a bit different. But again, you should be able just to take that default link, download it, install it, and run it. Now, once you have Node.js installed, it will give you NPM as well. Once you have that, you can use NPM to install the Vue CLI. That command will be npm space install space -g space @Vue CLI. So npm is the command line program. Install is what you're actually doing. -g means to make it global, so it basically is like installing a new program in your terminal that you could use everywhere. And then @Vue/CLI is the actual thing that you will be installing. So primary use case for having the CLI installed will be with scaffolding. So you begin with the name, so the name of your application. The CLI will ask you some questions, and then you will get some files. And when I say some files, I mean a large number of files. And don't worry, we're going to talk about what those files are. So as an example, I can go to my CLI, into my terminal and type Vue create and then the name of my project. So we're going to actually do that right now. So I'm going to go into terminal, and you can see on screen already I'm showing an example of the help screen, Vue -- help. I'm going to go into a trash folder, and I'm going to create, I'll call it November 2nd for today as the name of my application. Now the CLI will begin by prompting me for some questions, and depending on how you answer them, some questions may lead to more and so forth. If you take the default, you will get a Vue 2 application with certain settings picked for you. That is what I'm going to do. And at this point, it's going to start installing what it needs to do and scaffolding things out. It's a perfect time for me to take a sip of water. A big sip of water. I will say, if this seems a bit slow, I'm still in the older version of the Windows systems, subsystem for Linux. This is a work laptop I'm on, so I've not been able to update it. Latest WSL runs a heck of a lot quicker, so just trust me in that. You won't have to wait this long just to scaffold out an application. And obviously, if I was using Windows PowerShell, it'd probably be quite a bit faster as well. So it is grabbing all those assets, and hopefully it will not take too much longer. Looks like it's wrapping up, and it's going to do stuff. I think it's downloaded everything it needs to do. And again, this is a one-time scaffold. You know, after this is done, I won't have to do all this work again. And and it's almost done. I promise. Sweet. All right, so it is done. And what I really like about the CLI, and I wish more CLIs would do it, is that it literally tells you, you know, now that you're done, this is what you have to do to keep going. So we are going to do what it says, cd nov second, npm run serve. So I mentioned that npm is useful for installing programs. It also provides a simple way to run scripts. So if I have a project, I can define a way to kind of start it up, a way to debug it, a way to generate a final build, etc. that all interacts with npm. Or I could just do what the CLI says and just run it and see what happens. So this is going to run my Vue code, the application that will scaffold it out. I'm going to show you what it looks like in the browser and then talk about all of the files it made. And it made quite a few. So I can see it's running on localhost 8080. So we will pop that open, go to localhost 8080, and I could see, welcome to your Vue.js application with a bunch of links and stuff like that. By the way, in case you're wondering, the CLI does have an option to create what they call a bare application, where it gets rid of all this boilerplate text, makes it a bit simpler. You know, while you're learning, you may like to have this here, to have the kind of default text there. Once you know what you're doing, again, you can ask the CLI to make it a bit simpler. So let's look at what's in here. I'm going to maximize Visual Studio Code here. We're going to take a look at this folder, and we'll make things a bit bigger. All right, so there's some things in here. The first folder is going to be node_modules. The way that NPM works is that when it installs stuff, it essentially creates a folder to store all of those dependencies. There is a lot of stuff in this folder. In fact, I'll open it one time and you could see, like, I'm still in the A's. There's a lot of stuff in here. So this is important to know, because if you want to share your code with somebody else and you're not using GitHub or something like that, which, yes, not everyone is using source control. You should, but in the real world, sometimes you don't. And sometimes you just want to share a project with somebody else. You do not want to zip your folder with the node modules. What's cool is that a package made by NPM and the Vue CLI will have a file called package.json, which defines at a high level what all of those dependencies are. So if I want to zip this project up, I would erase node modules, zip up the rest, send it to them, and then they could run npm install in this folder, and it will get everything in Node module. So again, just going to keep that in mind if you're like sharing via zip and email, which I had to do last week for a client who's not using source control. So that is Node module. I also talked about package JSON. You can not worry about package lock JSON for right now. Git ignore will basically tell GitHub what not to worry about. Again, you can leave that alone. Babel config is used for the build process. That is something you could definitely ignore on day one. It is kind of an important topic, but you can not worry about it for right now. The public folder is where you would put assets that you don't need to work with. And by that, I mean simple graphics and things that'll just be copied into your final project. The real meat of your application is going to be in the source folder. And if we open this up, we'll see a couple things. Main.js is a script that essentially bootstraps your application. Now, this is something that's changed quite a bit in Vue 3.0, but in Vue 2, this is what you would see. Typically, you will not have to worry about touching this file, especially in your first couple projects while you're learning. The main application, that thing that you saw when I was showing my web browser, is app.vue. And we could see where I have that image, we have a component, and we have some script, and we have some style. Now, if you have never seen a Vue single file component, this is an excellent example of what it is. It has our layout, it has our logic, and it has styles all within one component. This is a big reason why if you've only used Vue for progressive enhancement, you may be a bit, worried or, concerned, not concerned, but, this will look pretty new to you. To me, I find it a heck of a lot easier to work with because to me, I see three distinct areas. So I know that when I'm working in my layout, I go in this a particular part. When I'm working in logic, I go in another particular part. It all works pretty well. You get a subcomponent hello world built for you that if you want to, you can get rid of and replace with your own. But what's cool is that this is the server that we started, npm run serve. It's a live server. And if I go in here and get rid of that image tag and type hello world, we will see that change automatically. So you can begin working in these folders, again, ignoring for now what I talked about. You can work on your project. You can add additional components. And when you're done, npm run build, not run dist, is how you will actually create the final version of your application. It's going to look at those source files, and it's going to build it for production, as it's telling you nicely on screen there. And when it is done, you will have a folder called dist that will store all of your application files. So again, like I said, my WSL is a little bit slow, but that didn't take too long. But I could see it's done. I got a nice report, and especially talking about how it compressed and compiled files. And if I were to go back to Studio, you could see my dist has a CSS, a JS, and an index.html file. And also a fav icon as well, but essentially this can be deployed without any build process at all. Now I will say services like Netlify and Vercel would allow you to deploy the Vue application as is if you tell them how to run the build process, basically what I just did at the command line. Netlify, for example, can do that for you. What's nice about that then is that you have your project in source control, you commit something, it automatically updates and runs that particular command for you. So one more quick feature I want to show in the command line is that if you want to add a feature, I can use the CLI and do, for example, Vue add router. And what it will do is add the dependencies for the Vue router for me. It will also modify code, so it's giving me a warning here because I did change stuff. I will say yes, go ahead and proceed. It will do what it needs to do. And again, we'll let it install dependencies. Take another sip of water. I'll take the defaults for everything. And it's working, it's chewing through, it's thinking about things, and it is almost done. Yes, all right, so if I actually go back to my source code, I can see it not only did it modify my code, it actually added a router folder, it added a views folder for different views, and my app.view has been changed. So again, it did warn me that, hey, you have uncommitted changes, are you sure? But I was able to add a whole new feature to my application directly via the CLI, and Vue add router is about as simple as you can get. So that is scaffolding. I showed you scaffolding. I showed you adding a new feature. I showed you, what you have to do to get the final output out. Let's look at a few other features of the CLI, one of them being the UI tool. This is a GUI tool that kind of does what I just did, but it does it via a simple web app. It's run via Vue UI. Now, if you do this, you will see Vue UI. We will run this. It's going to start the GUI, and it should pop open. There we go, in my browser. And you can see it has some default text in there. If I look at this, it's looking at a project. Now, this is actually the last project I worked on. I did some testing earlier, but I can import new projects as well. So if I go to my Vue Project Manager, this is one I built earlier today. The one that I just built, if I go up here and go to November 2nd and say import this folder. So it essentially kind of does what the CLI did. So if I wanted to add features or add additional plugins, for example, in this case, it recognizes that I have the router installed and says, hey, a lot of people use Vuex, maybe you want to use that. It also allows me to look at my dependencies, look at my configuration, and also run tasks. So I could actually run a build from here by going into task and clicking on build, and we will run the task now. So again, if you are not a CLI person, if you're the kind of person where you use the CLI when you have to, and again, there's nothing wrong with that, this could be kind of a nicer way to get some things done. It is in beta, as you can see there on the title. It's not something, honestly, that I use a lot of, but I could definitely see it being a nice tool. So that was the GUI. There's also a prototyping tool. Again, it's not something I use very often, but I'll show it to you. It's run via Vue Serve. It requires another install, and what's cool is that the CLI will tell you exactly what you have to do. And then once you do that, you can run Vue Serve again, and then it may fail again because it's going to look for, by default, a couple specific file names, and you could tell it one instead. But you can just make your component to test. So for example, I have a single file component here. Has a little bit of layout, has a little bit of data, and a little bit of CSS. But what I can do is go to my command line, we'll kill the GUI, and I put it in the trash. So I'm going to say Vue Serve, and it should pick up app.vue, and it's going to work on just that one particular file. So it's going to do what it has to do. It's thinking about it. It's going to run at localhost 8080 again. So we'll go back to our tab and reload, and I'll see my logic. And this also will have hot reload. So if I go back in here and let's say it's modified, 8 cats is too much, should be 4, although you can never have too many kitties. Save it, reload, and I have 4. I should say 3 because I went 1, 2, 4. So again, prototyping, if you have one component you want to work with and you want to maybe see, or maybe for example, work on just the CSS. The last time I used this, actually, it was a CSS thing where I was working on a component in an application, and it was kind of a big application, and I was just having trouble getting the CSS right. I actually, yanked the component out. I worked via Vue Serve, and it was a bit more direct and focused, and I was able to get it kind of working a bit easier that way. So that was really, really quick. In terms of where to go next, there are docs for the CLI. Honestly, I find Vue --help typically good enough for what I'm doing. So don't forget to do that as well. If single file components look really alien to you, the main Vue docs do have a page just on that particular aspect. Another thing to consider, Code Sandbox. I mentioned CodePen earlier. I like CodePen for small Vue samples, but when I'm building Vue applications, Code Sandbox works really, really well. And if I did not make you less afraid of the CLI, that's fine. Go to Code Sandbox, where they will do all of that for you. You can basically just say, make me a Vue application, and they do all of that for you and just give you the files to start working with. That's another great way to start playing if you're not terribly comfortable working at the CLI. Well, that was a lot of information. Thank you so much for paying attention. Thank you so much for showing up. I greatly appreciate it. If you have any questions, now is the time to ask them.